So sometimes you can take this perspective and say, okay, well, was there a change? Um, and the changes are kind of a different approach to getting pollinated if we're looking at flowers. So kind of two pressures happening. There's maybe the simpler version to be like your ancestors or your nearest relatives, as I've got it here. And then maybe an incentive become different from your relatives. So here we have differences in flower shape, flower color. You can see lots of different colors on there. These are members of the genus Salvia, which is a very diverse genus in the mint family. And then a nice little snapshot here of a wide variety of flowers. They're main pollinators, so bees for several of these, hummingbirds for others. You can see some of the traits that are changing. So the openness of the flower, the relative size of the flower, colors, obviously. This one's a very closed up flower, maybe attracting a hummingbird that's got a beak that can pierce into that flower, and so on. So staying the same is simpler. It's kind of the default is to be the same as your ancestors and your close relatives. The problem with being similar to your relatives is you might end up competing with them. So we get into kind of evolutionary theory a little bit here. If you are a new species and you're doing exactly the same thing as another species, one of you is probably going to go extinct. So two species that are competing too much end up driving one or the other of them to extinction. So they become different, then they can figure out ways not to compete. So it's very generalized here to just bees, but if you're attracting a different kind of bee than somebody else, that can be enough to get one of you pollinated by one species and one of you pollinated by another species. And by separating out your strategies, by not mixing your pollen, that's a good way to keep these species independent and effectively pollinated. So again, with a phylogeny, you can see these patterns, lots of instances here with pollination type of bee, so ancestral bee pollination, and then important shift here to bird pollination, and then a few of these shifting back to bee pollination. And so it's kind of a neat story. The more you understand about these phylogenies, you can kind of tell a story about how the species got to be where they are today. You understand the common ancestor, and you also understand potentially the pressures to become different in your local habitat. All right, so getting into the topic of pollination, we're going to talk about this as a sort of a biology of plants kind of conversation. And I want to emphasize the difference between these two phases of reproduction, sexual reproduction in a plant's life. So plants, we often think about them not moving, and that's okay. Plants really are not moving for most of their life. They're rooted in place. That's most plants. And to get around, it's more often a matter of getting around during the process of sexual reproduction. So moving their genetic material can happen during the pollination process. So you could think of that as moving. It's basically the pollen from the male portion of the plant can go out and cross great distances and end up pollinating a plant quite far away, the female portion of a different plant of the same species. So in that sense, the male plants can move their genetic material into a new location. Female portions of the plant can receive genetic material from males farther away. And that's a whole different part of the process, right? So pollination involves moving from the anthers to the stigma within a same species. And it's more of a directed, targeted effort. So the pollen has to land here. It can't just land on the ground. It's got to land specifically on the receptive part of a female flower, or the female portion of a flower. Seed dispersal, we often think about as well. This is a different phase of the life cycle. So once fertilization has happened, fertilization results in seeds. Seeds can move around. And that involves setting up a whole new plant. So the seed has within it the embryo, which can grow up into its own plant. So in the case of seed dispersal, the whole plant can move. In the case of pollination, it's sort of like the genetics of one of the parents can move. So we're going to talk about pollination as the topic of this lecture, and lots of different ways for animals, or sorry, for plants to get pollinated. Could be pollinated by animals, that's what we often think about. And it's also quite common for plants to get pollinated without any animal assistance. So we have these terms biotic and abiotic. Biotic means that there is an animal involved, something alive, which is an animal visiting flowers. And then the other version is abiotic. And the most common way for plants to get abiotic pollination is through wind pollination. So we've kind of talked about this before. I want to emphasize it more in this lecture. A couple examples on the left here of plants that have wind pollination. So in wind pollination, you often see these small nondescript flowers. In the oaks here, this is just a dangling catkin of male flowers on the oak. They're going to burst open their anthers and release a bunch of pollen into the air. So no animals involved, and that abundant pollen is going to float on the breeze and then ideally land on a stigma of the same species. Here's one here. This is a plant showing male and female components in the same inflorescence. This is a plantain, genus Plantago. And we've got these big anthers. That's often a good sign for wind pollination. It's just large anthers, big investment in pollen production. And then these feathery sticks coming out of here, those are the stigmas. So pollen production and pollen receipt in the same inflorescence at this moment. Biotic versus abiotic pollination, there are some trade-offs here. So in an animal pollinated flower, the plant typically has to put more energy into attracting animals to visit their flowers. So there's visual attraction to show them where the flower is. And then there's some kind of incentive for the animal to be there. The animals don't just pollinate out of the goodness of their little animal hearts. They visit flowers because there's something in it for them. So there's nectar production. Some flowers offer pollen as a reward. Some flowers trick their animals, as we've seen, trick animals into visiting them. And the upshot of this is this effort in attracting animals can mean that they don't have to produce as much pollen. So there's still lots of stamens produced here, but they could on average get away with a lot less pollen in these animal pollinated flowers because they have a delivery service, as opposed to the wind pollinated flowers that can't guarantee their pollen is going to end up anywhere useful. So most of those pollen grains don't go somewhere they should. Some of them do, enough of them do to make this worthwhile. So some examples of abiotic pollination, just typically, as I've shown you in a few cases, big pollen production. So lots of strictly male flowers here on this ragweed, catkins of male flowers here. We've got all these dangling anthers in this grass, big pollen production. And then a big surface area for the female part of the flower to receive the pollen. So these feathery bits on the grass are the stigmas. They're going to catch the pollen. This is a cluster of stigmas on this hazel, ready to catch pollen. This is a female, whole bunch of female flowers with their stigmas, big feathery stigmas ready to catch pollen. Very microscopic, not something you would see, but pretty effective. And I guess if we're thinking about this, soon enough in the spring, we're going to have our pollen allergies show up. And big reason we have pollen allergies is these wind pollinated plants are putting out so much pollen. They've got to make sure that some of that pollen makes it to a stigma, but they got to play the numbers. And so they have to put a whole bunch of it out there, and a lot of it ends up your nose. So if you've got allergies, I'm sorry for you this time of year. Just a little side note about wind pollination, and really every kind of pollination we're going to talk about, is that you just can't speak absolutely about pollination. You can't look at a flower and say, that's visited exclusively by this kind of animal. You can't look at wind pollinated plants and say that plant is exclusively wind pollinated, because there are so many exceptions as shown here. These are plants that you would mostly call wind pollinated, being visited by all kinds of bees and flies. So if there's any resource to be gained, even eating pollen, or maybe sometimes there's a little sugary nectar coming out of these, if there's anything that's going to benefit them, the animals will find it. So where do we find wind pollination? We often find wind pollination as a modified a derived inflorescence structure or a reproductive strategy. So the ancestral version of pollination in flowering plants was to be visited by animals. That's the big advantage of flowers. I mean, we talk about the flowering plants. Their relatives, the non-flowering plants, often are wind pollinated. But having this flower with petals and nectar and shapes that can manipulate the arrangement of a pollinator, those are all big advantages for flowering plants. So ancestrally, they have showy flowers, and in many cases, they've lost those abilities and switched over to being wind pollinated. So I have on the left, two plants that are actually in the same genus, the Lictrum. Nice one with a big showy petals, still lots of stamens, but obviously a more attractive, visually attractive surface here to attract animals. And then a relative of that plant, a few of these, the Lictrum dioicum, the petals are much reduced and the stamens are dangly, and they've switched over to being exclusively male flowers. So a good way not to pollinate yourself if you're releasing a whole bunch of pollen is to have your male flowers somewhere else than your female flowers. And this species name, dioicum, even tells us this is a dioecious plant, the Lictrum dioicum. So male flowers on a male plant, pollinating female flowers that happen on female plants. Here's ambrosia, one of our biggest sources of pollen allergy in the fall. So this is the ragweed genus Ambrosia, and one of its relatives in the sunflower family. So if you weren't sure about the ancestry of flowers being showy or wind pollinated, you can put it on a phylogeny. And here we have wind pollination reconstructed on the right-hand side here. Wind pollination, insect pollination, animal pollination being ancestral, all these white colored bars, and then a few cases where these plants have become wind pollinated. So by losing features, which is maybe easier than gaining new features, you can sort of direct your attention to bigger anthers, smaller petals, and you get one of these wind pollinated flowers. Again, in the context of selection, this is something that can happen rather quickly in evolutionary time. So we see it's not unique. We have wind pollination, wind pollination, wind pollination, multiple origins of wind pollinated flowers in this group. And that's just because there'd be a common advantage to getting there. And you would be mistaken if you tried to group all the wind pollinated plants together in the same classification, because they have, as we see, evolved independently quite a few times. So wind pollination, as I suggested before, often correlates with these unisexual flowers. Wind pollination is much more haphazard, so you've got lots of pollen out there, and you stand a better chance of pollinating yourself if you've got anthers and stigma in close proximity. So these cases here, this is monoecious plants in this group, dioecious plants in this group, and they are paralleling quite well with these wind pollinated plants, at least in this group here. Here's another dioecious plant group across from wind pollination. So the correlated strategy. So maybe something you'd also need to think about as you're classifying these is you can have more than one feature that evolved together still in a convergent fashion. So even though you've got wind pollinated dioecious plants up here and down here, they did not get that way from a common ancestor that was dioecious or wind pollinated.